This is a Skewb, and this is a Pyraminx. They're two completely different puzzles. Or are they? Today we will be seeing how a Pyraminx and a Skewb are more similar than you would think, and even try to figure out if you can solve a Pyraminx like you would a Skewb, and vice versa. But before I show you exactly what the similarities and differences are between these cubes, let's try to figure this out together. Let's first look at the 3x3. We have 3 axes of rotation, 1, 2, and 3. On each axis of rotation, we have 2 places where we can turn, the front and back, left and right, and finally, top and bottom. On a Pyraminx, however, there are only 4 main axes you can rotate the cube on. Holding it like this, there is a left axis, a right axis, a top axis, and finally a back axis. Furthermore, ignoring the tips, which don't actually contribute any meaning to the puzzle, on each axis there is only one possible place to turn, that side. So on the left axis, there is only the left side you can turn. Now let's look at Skewb and see if we can find any similarities. Skewb turns around the corners, like this. Top right corner, top left corner, etc. Now you may be tempted to think that there are 8 corners on this cube, so surely there are 8 different places to turn the puzzle, unlike Pyraminx. However, this is untrue. Observe when I'm turning around this white, blue, and red corner. If we shift our perspective a little bit, you see that it's almost equivalent to turning around the yellow, orange, and green corner. These 2 actions are essentially the same. Interesting. What this basically means that opposite corners constitute one axis of rotation, which if you think about it, makes a lot of sense. Thus, following this pattern, there is really only half the number of corners, or 4 axes of rotation, with only one place to turn on each axis. Now that sounds a lot more familiar. Now of course, opposite corners aren't really just one center that are combined together. They are still separate pieces. In reality on Skewb, there are only 4 quote-unquote real corners, which act as the cores for the axes of rotation. Now you can figure out which ones are real by tugging slightly on the corners. As you can see, this corner budges out a lot more than this one, so this one is real. If we identify all of the quote-unquote real corners, we'll find that these 4 are our real corners. Now what you'll realize is that these corners are arranged quite similarly to the ways that the Pyraminx centerpieces, which are these pieces under the tips, are arranged. Now let's associate the rest of the pieces on the Pyraminx to the Skewb. On the Pyraminx, the pieces right next to or adjacent to the centers are the edges. Similarly on Skewb, the pieces right adjacent to the centers are our middle squares. These are equivalent to the edges on Pyraminx. Ignoring the tips again, there are only centers and edges on the Pyraminx, and we associated them to 4 of the corners and 4 middle squares on Skewb. But there are actually 4 pieces left on Skewb, the remaining 4 corners that we didn't associate to a center. And actually, these don't correspond to anything on Pyraminx and were extra pieces added when Skewb was made based off the Pyraminx. Here's a bit of history. Pyraminx was originally patented by Meffert in the 1900s, and a little bit later, he created a shape mod of the Pyraminx as a cube, following the same core design. In fact, looking at the Skewb and Pyraminx cores, you'll realize that they are exactly the same. However, working with only the pieces that correspond to a Pyraminx, it was difficult to create a cube shape. Thus, he added 4 extra pieces, the corners that we now know as non-centers, to make the Skewb cubic. Now, even though we call this cube now a Skewb, it was actually originally called the Pyraminx cube when it was first created. Later, Douglas Hofstadter in his Metamagical Themis magazine named the Pyraminx cube a Skewb. Meffert liked it and officially renamed the Pyraminx cube into what we now know it today, the Skewb. In other words, Skewb was always a shape mod of the Pyraminx, and it was quite literally in its name. Finally, let's talk about whether or not you can solve the puzzles with each other's methods. The answer is unfortunately that you can't solve a Skewb like a Pyraminx or a Pyraminx like a Skewb directly. Let's start with the easy one. You can't solve a Skewb like a Pyraminx because, as we mentioned, there are 4 extra corners compared to the Pyraminx. If we use the standard Pyraminx method, those corners will remain unsolved and won't be oriented correctly either. Solving a Pyraminx in a Skewb method has a bit more of a hidden flaw, and even though there aren't any extra pieces, we have to remember that the edges on the Pyraminx were associated with the middle squares on the Skewb. However, the Pyraminx edges have 2 orientations, while the center on the Skewb only has one orientation. Thus, using a similar logic as before, if we use the skew method on the Pyraminx, the edges might be in the correct position, but they won't be flipped correctly. Nonetheless, there have been many people who have adapted skew methods for Pyraminx and vice versa. If you're interested, feel free to look it up, though I won't be demonstrating how this works in this video. Now that you know that this Skewb and this Pyraminx are actually more similar than it seems, it's a perfect way to show that you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, and a puzzle by how it looks. Sometimes, even though a puzzle seems like it doesn't have much to offer, if you look hard enough, there's always something interesting that it holds. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye!